If you've ever tried to learn a language in the age of the digital, you probably already know that it can be something of a daunting task. From apps to guides to gurus, there's an infinite amount of information out there, and it all tells you something different. It can make you feel like you're trying to navigate where to go in a stormy sea of information, like you're never going to make the right choice, and that can completely murder your motivation. If this sounds like you, if you want to learn Japanese but you don't know how, you're in the right spot. I'm Fuza, and this is Japanese 101. By the end of this video, you'll have a very clear path to follow from thinking about it to being self-sufficient in the domain of learning Japanese. So sit back, relax, and listen up as I teach you how to approach learning. First up is that this guide focuses on reading and eventually listening, both of which are input skills, the other skills being speaking and writing. I believe that reading is the most essential to build proficiency, though sometime down the road I do intend to come back to the output. So if it's like navigating a sea of information, why bother making another guide? In short, it's because there's a lot of faux resources that really just want your money, and more guides that aren't that are almost never a bad thing. Stick around for more on that almost in just a bit. All that said, what is my take? I think that learning to comprehend input in any given language can be split into 3 general stages, each with its own tasks and challenges. First is laying the foundation. Second, the fundamental skills. Lastly, immersion, diversification, and upkeep. The naming of these phases should serve to be a summary of what you'll be putting most of your time into, though you can expect there to be some overlap between them. Without further ado, on to stage 1. This section is focused on getting you ready to learn and covering the absolute basics. The steps are as follows. Firstly, you'll want to read the Tofugu Kana guides. Both of them. They're linked in the description. They're not particularly long, and you'll need them to understand the grammar guide that you'll be reading soon enough. Secondly, you'll want to watch Tofugu's video on pronouncing the Japanese R, which is also linked in the description. This is a neat video that demonstrates a good way to learn something that will be necessary sooner or later. I personally think that the earlier you learn it, the better, since you don't want to develop a bad habit that you'll have to break down the road. Finally, get Anki and this deck, both linked below the R noise video. Start it as soon as you finish the Kana guides, as it'll reinforce your learning. These 3 things won't take long. Really, you should have the Kanas memorized in about a week. If that ends up not being the case, don't worry. Just move on, because any and every time you see them anywhere at all, they'll be reinforced further. You'll get them naturally and in no time at all. This leads to an important note. Do your Anki cards every day. It is essential to Anki working correctly, and having a routine makes learning so much easier in the long run. At this point, it's just necessary to keep on top of Anki, but later you'll have more to manage, so it's a very, very valuable habit to get into early. Once those are said and done, you've started the process of studying a language by building a foundation. With this, you've covered the first step. As trivial as it might seem, it's one huge step towards knowing that language, and one that most people just won't take. Good stuff. But before we get into the second bit, we're going to come back to that almost that I mentioned at the beginning regarding faux resources. Good guides are always nice to have, because the more the merrier, right? Sort of. Options and variety are nice to have, but there's a large caveat when you're starting out that quite a few people fall into. This is too much studying how to study. It's a cycle of looking up the best possible resources you can find, or the best guides and whatnot, just to compare them endlessly instead of actually sitting down to study. This happens a lot. It's probably one of the most common reasons I actually see people give up. Here's a tip that I can and do give to everyone who asks me about languages. The guide you stick with will take you farther than the best. Theorizing about studying is one of the most common things that catches people. It all counts. Anything that involves Japanese will improve your skills, and everything will make a difference. So if you're having fun, why do you care that you could be more efficient? What I mean by this is that in the time you've tried to find the best, you could have been making progress. So don't waste your precious time, pick one that works, and stick to it. It doesn't need to be the greatest as long as it gets you through. With that, you're good to go ahead and start stage 2, where we get into the language proper. Welcome aboard the Language Learning Express. First stop, grammar. This is arguably the most dry part of learning a language, but don't despair. It doesn't have to be boring or even as slow as most would expect. It is, however, a step you cannot skip. Grammar is the backbone of understanding, the knowledge that brings the words you learn together, like the notch in a pair of puzzle pieces. While this may sound like some guru garbage, it really is that simple a reason, so don't skip this bit. That said, even though I just recommended sticking with whatever works, there is still a certain amount that you have to experiment with different resources to find what actually is the thing that works. To summarize the criteria that's worked best for me, 1. Concise formatting is best. The goal is to prime your brain with knowledge of how grammar works, and for that, the easier to read, the better. Avoiding large walls of text is ideal. 2. Avoid the overly technical books. This is something I frequently notice with school textbooks in particular. There's an overabundance of jargon and stiff, formal expressions that can do more harm than good in the long run. And third, an emphasis on knowledge over rote memorization, because if it doesn't make sense, no amount of drilling will make it easier. This leads me to recommending Takem's Grammar Guide as my personal pick. The guide is delivered in a very concise way. Explanations are to the point, there isn't much jargon to complicate it, and the emphasis rests on gaining knowledge of grammar rather than drilling it. It's available in quite a few formats, but after reading the PDF to completion, I personally recommend the blog itself as the version to read. I can't speak to the printed book, and while the PDF did work, the blog's formatting makes the text as a whole much more digestible. There's a clear division of topics, and the quicker, better overall navigation lends to the blog being readable for any length of time, and less of a giant, never-ending wall of words about words. You'll want to finish reading this guide as soon as possible. Do not worry about memorizing all the grammar rules. You will forget most of it, and that's fine, because memorizing grammar doesn't equate to comprehension anyways. Reading the guide is more about wrapping your head around the concepts and getting yourself used to how the language works. So as long as you can understand the concept, you're good to press onward. Even if you don't quite get something, just skip it and move on. You'll pick it up with time and immersion. This also leads well into my next point. Skip the examples. All of them. While it sounds counterintuitive, sentences without context, like these, that you tend to see in grammar books will hardly stick in your brain, and the value of the gained in comprehension will be outclassed entirely by any form of immersion soon enough. The goal of the guide is to familiarize yourself with the concepts of the language, not to memorize the rules and constructions for every single topic you read. If it helps, think of it like priming an engine. It's necessary to prime it before you start it, but it isn't the act of starting the engine itself. With examples out, most grammar resources become much easier to read. There is still a lot to read anyways, but it makes a notable difference. I strongly recommend that you just get a move on with the guide at this point, but if you feel that you need examples while you're reading your guide, I recommend getting the Dictionary of Japanese Grammar Anki deck and studying that over doing anything else, as it fits 2 of our 3 criteria for resources: concise and not overly technical. Since the grammar is presented as a dictionary and is professionally written, it makes for a better Anki deck with its structure than other resources. Keep in mind, however, drilling grammar you don't understand will ultimately do very little for you. That's my 2 cents on examples anyways, so take that as you will. The train is now arriving at early immersion. This is how most people feel going into early immersion. Suffice to say, it is considered the most difficult part of learning any language, but that also means it's among the most rewarding parts too. But first, why immersion? Why so early? Why not just study more until you're ready? To sprinkle some philosophy into this video, Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Knowing may very well be half the battle, but it's only up to exactly that. Half. Immersion is doing. It is using Japanese. It is reading manga, watching anime, playing games, and so on. Studying can't fill that gap. Neither can Codex, nor grammar guides, word lists, and all the rest of it. Don't get me wrong, these resources absolutely have their uses, but they just aren't immersion. With that answered, it circles back to the point of, if you put in the effort, the results will come. But what makes it so hard? There are 2 particular things. First, commitment. As I said earlier, it's easy to not commit to learning languages because of the very nature of it. They're completely different ways of delivering information and require very explicit work to progress with. Second is the extremely steep learning curve. Learning grammar is a matter of reading Takem and understanding the explanations. Putting the grammar into practice requires much more deliberate effort. The amount you immerse yourself directly correlates with how well you perform. If you take any one thing away from this video, let it be this. No matter how much you prepare with grammar explanations, core vocabulary, whatever else you use, you will never be ready to immerse. Again, knowing is only half the battle. This is to say, you will stop on more words than you can count, you will have to look up grammar points you've read about, and you will almost certainly feel like you know nothing. This is normal, and while it might make you feel bad, I promise it's not all that terrible. At this point, you're past the beginner curve. You're not just learning about how a language works, you're genuinely learning the language. Every single thing you do from here on out, as long as you are consciously interacting with the language, will build your understanding. Since this early immersion is much more energy consuming than most other parts of learning a language, I highly recommend 2 things here. 1, if you've managed without a routine so far, that should change. Having a routine makes commitment much easier. and it will make the increase in your skill more consistent than if you just go it out whenever. It doesn't need to be much, just something to keep it in your mind, preferably at least once a day. Start small and build from there. Many people struggle with this. Even I have to admit I'm still trying to get better at being consistent. And try to stick to one of two branches of media. Things you've read before and are already familiar with, or things that are simple. This makes it much less frustrating since context will be easier to figure out in a simple media or one you already know than, say, Monogatari on a first time read. This is only for a short time while the foundation sets. If you're wondering what I mean by that, consider what I said not long ago. The guide was priming your brain to learn because reading about how grammar works doesn't directly translate to understanding the grammar in context. This is also why I chose to skip examples. This is the point in learning where you actually begin to internalize things. Your metaphorical engine is now running. You'll still have trouble reading, but before long you'll get a feel for the language. I can't recommend putting too much stock into listening right now, since it's a much less controlled activity. We want as few variables as possible while the foundation is set, or else we risk having too much going on at once and getting nothing out of it. This is also, unfortunately, another major point where people will quit. The aforementioned uncountable number of times you'll be looking at words and grammar points can really take the wind out of your sail. On the bright side, it's pretty easy to find your own flow when looking things up, and I can almost guarantee you'll find it once you've put some time in. This actually leads us into the third overall stage. This is what I consider the last stage of language learning. It comes after you finish your early immersion, giving you time to get the basics settled into your brain with context. This is a good time to start integrating audio-focused media into your immersion. Between drama and anime, whatever turns your crank, since you can control your playback and ease yourself in using Japanese subtitles. A more novel alternative for those seeking something paced a bit differently can be found in VTubers. While I haven't personally explored them in this context, the environment and the highly contextually driven nature of streaming allows me to hazard a guess that they can be a valuable source of immersion worth considering. Now, before anybody says, Fuza, you can't learn Japanese from anime. Unless you have the impressionability of a child, you can use whatever you want for immersion, be it games, manga, light novels, or yes, anime. Virtually every fictional media in Japanese employs these traits that people are finding in anime, which is called role language. So it makes no sense to single out anime as unusable for immersion. And though I'm not going to get into the specifics of role language and how it impacts learning, think about it. Someone watching Looney Tunes would understand that real humans don't generally speak in the way that Bugs Bunny says his trademark, "Nah, what's up, Doc?" The character has dialogue that's obviously exaggerated, and with that comes phrases, keywords, and general mannerisms that match the nature of his character. Anime works on the same principle. Keywords, key phrases, and key mannerisms that fall into the concept of role language. There's reading you can do in it, but simply being aware of it should be enough for what you need at this point. Long made short, use whatever interests you for your immersion. Mini tangent aside, to go along with the integration of audio into your immersion, now's the time to diversify your reading too. Read new, more difficult genres. Jump into light novels. Throw yourself in the same way you would as if you were reading in your native language. The key here is to change it up. It keeps things interesting and it keeps you from stagnating. And lastly, U for upkeep is simple. Keep it up. Keep reading, keep trying new things, keep doing what you're doing, and you'll keep getting better. Remember, nothing in language is meaningless. Anything you do, everything you do, will all make you better. Once you've made it to this point in the guide, take a moment to reflect on how far you've come and give yourself a pat on the back. You've undoubtedly come a long way, and honestly, even with a perfect guide or all the time in the world to immerse, many people just won't stick to it for one reason or another. But you did, or you will, so great job. Otherwise, that just about does it for my guide to the approach to Japanese. I'll update the guide in the future as I feel necessary, and I do intend to keep my channel populated with new language learning videos in the future. So if you liked what I've got here, consider sharing or even subscribing. It shows me that it's worth making more of this stuff because, believe you me, even just writing the script for this video took me way longer than I anticipated. Now, before I duck out, if you have any questions or your own advice that you'd like to share, by all means, write a comment here or send it my way on Twitter. Questions I'll respond to as best as I can, and suggestions I'll look into. But that's it for now. Wherever you are, whenever it is, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.